Hi Virtual SQL Bits, my name's Mark and I'm here to talk to you about Azure Synapse Analytics and modernising and migrating your data warehouse. So let's get down to it. There we go. So my name is Mark Pryce-Maher. I'm an architect. I work for Microsoft. I'm in the customer success engineering team for Azure Synapse Analytics. So previously that was purely focused on what we used to call Azure SQL Data Warehouse, but now is called SQL Pools. But now we are the Synapse Analytics team, so we now deal with SQL Pools, SQL Serverless, and Spark. So there's my contact details. This is as you might have seen, this is take 3000, and the previous run was 75 minutes, so I need to cut that down on this run. So hopefully we'll get through it a little bit faster than I did before. But I'm having a bit of a Groundhog Day. All right, so what are we going to cover in this session? So first of all, who should attend the session, and then why people migrate, the blockers, Azure Synapse Analytics, what it is, it's more than a data warehouse, migration process, the tools, and use cases and experiences. But what I'm actually doing, instead of doing use case experiences at the end, I'm going to be talking about them as we go. So it's not just a kind of a segment. So I'll just be intermingling, when we talk about different technology, where I've used it in different places. So right, audience, who should attend? So anyone who is doing any kind of migration, doesn't have to be to Azure Synapse or SQL Data Warehouse or even a Microsoft product, because all the ideas and concepts for most of this talk are all generic. If you're going to migrate from something to something else, the exactly same things that you need to be concerned about. So stay tuned. All right. So why do people migrate? So people migrate obviously for lots of different reasons. One is the appliance might be going out of support, so the APS might be going out of support, or the Netezza box or the Teradata support contract is coming to an end, and there's a license negotiation. And normally as part of that, people consider getting off the platform. Sometimes it's the applications, the ETL, the upstream systems, the downstream systems that are going out of support or changing, and they just want to refresh the whole platform. The other is company-wide adoption of the cloud. Now these generally don't drive wholesale migrations, but they will colour when people are thinking about moving off their appliances to something else, or they'll go cloud first. Ideally, reduction in costs. So because we deal in a capex model rather than opex model, so an opex rather than capex, so operational costs, the monthly charging of Azure or any cloud service over the capital expenditure of having to buy a very expensive appliance. And also skills. This might not seem so obvious, but I've worked with companies that say, well, we don't have the skills in that platform anymore because everybody has left. So that's one of the reasons why we aren't going to just migrate. We're just not going to upgrade the appliance. We're actually going to migrate to a different platform. All right, so what are the kind of general high-level blockers? Probably the biggest one is the unknown, because although I like to think that lots of companies are using cloud models so far, and they're using different cloud vendors, a lot of them aren't. They are still very much on-prem, and dabbling into the cloud is brand new for them. So they just don't know how this is going to work. They don't know just how the whole system is going to work. They're very much this is all brand new, and it's quite scary for them. Obviously then there are skills, which are, do they have the right skills to move to that cloud vendor? Because sometimes they might be on a different cloud vendor and they're not sure about transferring skills to different cloud vendors. Do they have skills in that platform? Are they familiar with that sort of service? Something that I do talk to when I talk to people who have, Netezzas, Teradatas, Exadatas, or any MPP platform that SQL Data Warehouse or Synapse SQL Pool is an MPP platform. they already know how most of it works, or because they've worked on MPP platforms before. So what they don't know is the syntax and lots of little nuances, but they have a very good starting model. They're not starting from scratch. And time, I find time is quite often a driver, because they don't know how long it's going to take. So they sometimes have the misconception it'll be very, very quick, or they've got to get off a previous platform by a certain time because the contract's renewed. So that's always a bit of a driver. And a lot of companies, we're seeing political and internal blockers. So, for example, a recent one I spoke to is the department that want to do the deployment don't own the cloud infrastructure. That's owned by a different team. If they want to do deployment, they have to talk to this other team, raise a request to that team, then builds an ARM template, checks the security. So even before they can play or even suggest to go forward with something or try it out, even for a proof of concept, they have to get this other team involved, and there was a 3-month backlog. Sizes and costs. Well, because we're moving to a brand new model, people are very unsure about, will this cost a lot? How big is it going to be? What's my monthly bill going to be like? And so we have some tools, some spreadsheets that help them kind of assess that. And also then architecture. What's my new architecture going to be like? Is it going to be the same as before? Do they have the skills in-house to actually design the new architecture? Think about all the little nuances, how all the services connect. What do they need to change? And we can help you with that as we're going on. All right. So when I get involved in a customer, the first thing, or any situation, the first thing I think is a SQL pool or any of the other services the right fit for this customer, for these use cases, for what they're talking to me about. So the answer is never Synapse. The answer is we'll see. So by doing that, we can be very open-minded and say, well, actually, maybe the data volumes are really low. So actually, it's not appropriate to have a SQL pool, but an MI instance or just a normal SQL instance might be better. Or, you've got a certain reporting tool. Now, you could spend a lot of time rewriting that, or you can just lift and shift it into Azure. So we have people using ETL tools, and it's easier, instead of going to the SaaS model version, the PaaS or the SaaS version of it, it's easier just to lift and shift the VMs and then move them into Azure. So what we do is we do basically, is it fit for purpose? And that's the first thing we want to see from the workload. I mean, if it's coming from Teradata, Netezza, Exadata, it pretty much will be. There's a few nuances about Teradata where it's very good at handling OLTP loads, so that's something we are very careful about. So, is the data big? Are they putting in a terabyte of data? If they haven't got a terabyte of data, is this the right thing? Because our other databases, the cloud databases, can handle that. If it's not more than a terabyte, then is it the right thing? But if you've got overnight processing that is massive, then maybe it is the right thing, even if your data isn't that big. The SQL pool isn't designed for OLTP workloads. Now, we can make it work, and I've done this for some customers, and I've had some very fast lookups. But because of the Synapse is more than just the SQL pool, we have the ability to integrate with other services, such as, there we go, should be opening up, Cosmos DB. So you do your OLTP workloads in Cosmos DB, and then you move the data is then moved to column store afterwards. It's sort of replicated out. So this is something that is quite exciting, and I think this is going to come for other services. So not just Cosmos DB, SQL DB, and other kind of databases. So this is a way of having your OLTP and your analytical workloads all in the same place. Let's go back to the slides. Slideshow. Current slide. There we go. All right. I've also found that a complete lift and shift is not necessarily the best approach. So if you were lifting and shifting in a teaser, maybe lifting and shifting Teradata, maybe not. Oracle, not sure. Hadoop, definitely not. SQL Server, possibly. What you actually want to do is consider it a new platform and then design it for the workload you're going to put on it. So rather than assuming that the performance characteristic from your Netezza, Teradata, Exadata on-prem system will also apply in the cloud, it's not true. The way the hardware works in these appliances, where you have very, very fast InfiniBand connections between the compute and the storage, they're tightly coupled, means the access to the storage is amazingly fast. But in a proper cloud architecture, the compute and the storage are separated out. So it's slower than your on-prem, but we then have extra things in the compute, and we can scale up the compute. And then we've got things like materialized views, results at caching, lots of CPUs, lots of RAM, NVMe disks that we have then in the compute nodes that you, for example, don't have in an APS. So look at the workload and make sure it's designed to get the best out of the platform. So not just the best out of SQL DW or SQL pools, but the best out of the platform. Because Synapse is more than just the data warehouse, it's more than just SQL on demand, it's more than just Spark. All right. So let's have a look at it. So Azure Synapse Analytics includes the data lake, the storage, the ADF, the data integration, the runtime. Here would be the provision SQL pool, or what we would call the SQL data warehouse traditionally, and then the SQL on demand, Spark, then the language, and then the new studio that sits on top. So this is more than, I like to say, it's more than the sum of its parts. It's a complete cloud-based analytics system rather than before, where you may have just had a simple Netezza doing the crunching, or an APS doing the crunching, or just Exadata just doing the crunching and serving that data up for a different layer. So how do we migrate? Well, we need a plan, and it's so important that I've got to mention it 3 times. So when I talk to customers, I don't talk about where they are now. A lot of the time I talk to them about where they want to be in 5 and 10 years, not just how they want to migrate off the system, because that's normally an immediate goal, and that's actually generally quite tactical. But from a strategic level, where do you want to be? Because the data warehouse or the SQL pool or whatever it is, it's just a part of that. And so we need to make sure that it's the right part to fit in, and if it's not, we then readdress. Architect. So we need to look at the current architecture, and then we need to work out what a new architecture could look like. And we have some things that will help with that. So we have some pre-canned architectures on the Microsoft website. So things like, this is a advanced analytics architecture. We also have big data analytics and automated enterprise BI architecture, data warehousing and analytics architecture. So these are great boilerplate architecture to say when they're moving from, do these apply? Because this starts to talk to you about the services that are involved and how to actually consider moving there. Assess. So I'm going to talk about this much later on, and why we need to assess, but assess where they are, assess what they've got, and only when you've assessed it can you then actually move on to do things like a POC. So then we've got the you've assessed what you currently got, you work out whether your proposed architecture would fit in, and then, well, customers are never normally happy with that. We've actually got to prove, because although that answers very high level details, but customers want to know, will it work at my scale? Will it work at, if I import in 240 billion rows, how quick will my lookups be? If I've got a 1 terabyte file, how long would that take to load? And they like to do it with, and it's much better to do it with our own data. Now, we can obviously give people, based upon this sample data that we have, this 1 terabyte file, it takes this long to load. But I found that actually it's very nuanced, because my 1 terabyte file might have 10 columns, but their one has 200 columns, and a lot of the columns are varchars. And so what we like to do is a POC, but with their data. So you can prove the points and prove that it is the right platform. But also, the reason why I like POCs, proof of concept, is you can prove that it does work, or you can prove that it doesn't work. These are both valid. So proving things, so a lot of people that I talk to don't like that aspect. They think a POC should be an MVP, should be the start of it going to production. And that's not really what a POC is for. If you aren't planning on scrapping it, what you've done, but taking what you've learned and then using that intellectual property that you've gained and and that experience you've gained, and then moving on. If you're planning on taking the original POC, then generally we're probably not on the right track. And I'll talk about the difference between a POC and an MVP, a minimal viable product, later. A phase migration is often better than moving the entire thing a big bang. So if I can move, for example, a few reports at a time, then I can show value to the business that this is working, rather than them having to wait 6 months, a year, 18 months before they see the first report. So working out what you have to do, this is actually a real MVP. Part of it is, what is the minimum I have to do to get report X working? So look at report X, you see that table A, B, C, D are used. And if I import just those, I can get that one report. But obviously tables A, B, C, D are used in several other reports. And maybe if you add table F, you then can do 5 or 10 reports. So what's the minimum we can do to get the most value out, to actually show some gain from the system? Because once we start spinning up resources in Azure, we're paying for them. So effectively there is a dual billing going on, because they've already paid for that existing hardware, that existing appliance, and then they're paying for the new one. If we can actually show value, then the business are going to be far more accepting of the fact that when the cost is coming through, and they're actually seeing some reports for that cost, rather than that cost coming through and them having to wait 6, 12, 18 months before they see a report. Plus it's easier to do. It's easier to deal with smaller problems, break it down, and deal with one big problem. Performance test. I've got a couple of customers that are doing this, and they're doing entire nightly loads as performance tests, and they're also doing migration tests. So they're taking they've both got big bang approaches where they extract out a load of data, import it in over a weekend, and they need that to happen within a certain period of time. And they are performance testing that to prove that it works. And because they've proven that it works, the business are then really happy. If you can, like DevOps, which stands for Developer Operations. So which is, and in our case, we like CI/CD, continuous integration and continuous deployment. So I like this because my developer days, and this is what we would do. We would write a bit of code, we would check it in, it would get automatically tested, and then it could be deployed. So this is something that I find that we should deploy in from the very beginning as a as a database, as a in a POC or an MVP or going live, because putting this in much later is just a bit of a pain. You know, in an MVP you could drop this, but actually then implementing it much later, getting everybody on board, can cause much more problems. You know, and if you've got a DevOps pipeline doing your deployment, well, deployments are really easy then. You don't have to have big bangs. You don't have to spend a lot of time on every single deployment. You know, if you make a problem with it, if there's a bug in a deployment, you want to fix it. You know, if you've then got to write a whole deployment script, that can take hours and hours, and then just can make the whole process much longer. So if we can get around that, let's use CI/CD. All right. And dummy runs and switchover processes. Do dual run. So some of my customers are dual running the old system and the new system, and then they're comparing data between the two using hash algorithms to compare multiple columns, not just row counts, to make sure that the data in both systems is correct, and that gives the business the confidence that the data is exactly the same. All right, assess. So this is where, before we get into the POC, this is normally when I talk to a customer or I get, in the first few days, I want to assess how difficult the migration could be. And so by doing that, the easiest way is to say, right, how much do we need to move? How many tables have you got? How many columns in each table? How many views? How many stored procedures? How many functions? How many shared libraries? That's more of a teaser thing. What's the volume of data size? By knowing kind of all that, you can say it's a big system, it's a small system. If there's lots of code and stored procedures that needs to be rewritten, well, that makes it a bit more complicated and may take a longer period of time. What ETL system are you using? Is it possible that how many ETL jobs have you got? Have you got 10, 20, 50 SSIS packages, or have you got 10, 20,000 data stage jobs? Have you got thousands of Informatica jobs that need to be rewritten? If the data types in your source system don't match, in your original system, don't match the data types in the SQL Data Warehouse or your destination system, you're going to have to do some work and remapping the ETLs. And I think some customers, so some third parties, will try and automate the ETL process. So in fact, when we do migrations, the actual moving of tables, views, and the data is a relatively small amount of time compared with the ETL. What upstream and source systems have you got? Because you might need to remap, the ETLs. You might need to move that data that was in an upstream system from a source system that was coming out of an accounting system. Then that needs to be moved into Azure. So that process needs to be written, and that process can take time. So a retail company have an APS, and they do their big batch loads every night, and they need to make sure that's done for the morning so the reports are done. Now, if they move to Azure, they need to make sure that when they move that file and import it into Data Warehouse, they have to include the time it takes to move that file from on-prem into the SQL Data Warehouse. And for us, the speed improvement of importing into SQL Data Warehouse was actually made it as quick, if not quicker, including the transfer time. So when you add the transfer time and the ETL time, it was still quicker than the on-prem system. Also the downstream systems and the reporting and the exports, and have they got analysis services? Have they got data marts? So you need to just assess kind of that, because if they've got analysis services multi-dimensional, well, you can't just, we don't have a cloud version of that in Azure. You have to move the VM up into Azure, or keep the VM on-prem and have a hybrid solution. But then you're moving data around again. And if you've got to move all your data and files up into Azure, do loads of processing, put them into tables, and then pull them out again to then pull down back onto the customer's site, and that could be a gig or two, then that's going to take a while. And then is that going to be slow? So a lot of the time we try and suggest moving that up into the cloud. and then your reporting systems, your cubes are then closer to your data. Reviewing the architecture. But if you assess, assessing the architecture, you can raise risks and issues early, and then you can use your POC to then address those and see whether they are. See, that's a nice segue. So I'm going to use the term POC, not MVP. We need to keep them very separate. And also some people use proof of value rather than proof of concept. And a proof of value is something else as well. So proof of concept for me is a small, time-bound project, very limited in scope, to focus on very specific issues. So the data ingest, or the performance of certain reports, or the concurrency. Now, whenever I talk to customers, and I've had this conversation, I say, look, you want to do a POC, so what's the most important report? And the answer is all of them. And you go, okay, so all right. Well, different tact. What's the most important table? All of them. What's the most important ETL job? All of them. And then when I say, well, I've got 2 weeks. Now, which are the most important ones? Because we need to time box it. We're not going to do a POC, which is effectively moving your entire system across. So normally we try and say, for a POC, identify a couple of use cases, so perhaps a couple of reports, a couple of end-to-end processes. So ideally something that shows data coming into the system, being processed, imported into tables, and then coming out into reports. I mean, other POCs I've done have only cared about the data ingest, or they've only cared about the concurrency, because I think one customer said, yeah, we know it will be fast, or we can just scale up. And they weren't worried. So I use POCs to say, well, let's focus on your areas of concern, so you're then not worried. So, because that will be the worst thing. You go forward and you're worried that this is the right platform for you. So the proof of concept for me is getting rid of those fears. Clear set of goals, and have a clear set of goals before you start. Ideally, if we were doing a use case of ingestion of some files, and then the report, some processing, overnight batch processing, and then some reports, how long does the ingest take on-prem? How long does the batch processing take on-prem? How long does it take to generate the reports on-prem? And then I can compare the times with the cloud version, or the whichever it is, SQL Data Warehouse or whatever it is, with the on-prem times. So if, for example, the on-prem time is faster, if it takes 10 seconds to do the ingest and it takes us 9 seconds, well, I'm not going to do any more work. I'm going to leave it there. But if the batch processing is taking 15 seconds overnight and we're taking 2 minutes, then I'll put my effort into making that. I won't worry about a second here or there for other things. So by having those figures up front, really help you to focus your time on what's important out of the POC. All right, and then the actual migration process. So once the customer and everybody's happy that this is going to work, you've gone through the POC, right, migration, and in fact, it looks really easy. Convert the schema, move the data, update the ETL, destinations, maybe rewrite scripts, update the sources for the reports, the downstream systems, test everything. But it's never that easy. Generally, you can convert the schemas, you can convert the views very quickly, because normally it's just a matter of remapping data types, importing the data. If you've got huge files, billions of rows in a fact table, for example, just export out the data in years. So just export out 2010, 2012, 2013, 2000, etc., all into different files. That's a really nice way of cutting down on having one large file, one bottleneck. Just export it all out that way. And then testing. So most of the work will be in the ETL. That's where we find that will be the killer. because if you have to rewrite lots of code because data types are different, or remap lots of destinations, and then you've got to test it all, and then if they're very complex like data stage where you might have thousands and they all link together, it's a lot of effort. So we just need to just be aware, your assessment should identify that, and should identify how long it takes, and then you can then work out how long it's going to take to rewrite each one. In our assessment tool that we have, our team wrote, we have a way of just assessing the amount of work it's going to take to move certain tables, etc. So to give you a scope, give you a ballpark figure, so you know roughly if this is how long this is going to take. Right, so let's look at what we've got to actually help with the tools we've got to help with all those processes. Right, so what I've done is, so you'll have the slides. I will put together, and I put together separate slides for each system. So the tools and scripts for migrating SQL Server, Netezza, DB2, Oracle, Exadata, Teradata, Sybase, Hadoop, and let's not forget ADF for all sorts of other migrations, because ADF can pull data out of lots of other systems. So what I've done is I've split the scripts into multiple sections for each thing, just to make it easier for you to find. Right, and we'll just quickly run through them. All right, don't forget ADF. If you're not a fan or you haven't used it, this is the way to get data off systems really easily. I mean, there are so many sources. So if you're migrating from something, there's a good chance it will be in here. Even if we haven't got other scripts for it, there is a, where's, I'm going to show you the Netezza, we've got all sorts of, where would be up here? Yeah. Oracle, Netezza, SAP, Spark, Sybase, Teradata, Vertica, Infomix, Impala, Hive, DB2, Redshift. So I've used a few of these in some of my migrations, including Redshift, Netezza, and a couple of others. So don't forget that they are there. Right. Now here is a very, very high level of most of the tools and the scripts that we have. So this, if you haven't seen it, Data Migration Microsoft. So if you're doing any migration, here is a really good place to start. So you pick your source system. I'm coming from SQL Server, and then I'm going to data warehouse. Now, obviously, if you weren't worried about data warehouse, you could go, how do I do it to MI? How do I do it to VMs? But data warehouse. Profile your workload. What kind of work are you doing? Are you using, for example, data types are incompatible? All the steps, there's articles on migrating your schema, your code, your data, doing a workload assessment, handling error issues, some white papers we've got for migrating across. So if you haven't seen this is a great website to go to. Coming from Oracle or Exadata, here's the SQL DW. Very similar, profile your workload. Here's some articles on migrating schemas, etc. Workload assessment, SQL Server inventory scripts, SQL Server management, SQL Server migration assistant, and some other things in there. DB2, we don't have a direct DB2 to SQL Data Warehouse, but you can go DB2 to SQL Server then go to SQL Data Warehouse, or go from SAP to SQL Data Warehouse. But essentially, it's the same kind of process. SQL Server Migration Assistant. So in fact, we're using this with the customer now to come from their Oracle. So download it. So the one I would highlight is that one. That has a data warehouse destination. The others don't, but they will dump out SQL, which you could then move across to SQL Data Warehouse. And this will automate a lot of the processing. And I've got something special to show you for that later. Okay, so this is a website. This is a GitHub that the team I work in put together. If you're doing an APS to SQL DW or Synapse migration, there's an entire workflow and all the steps you need to do to extract out and move to SQL Data Warehouse or Synapse Analytics, SQL pool. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? We also have some assessment scripts that we've been working on to assess the complexity of the migration. So initially we've got SQL Server, we've got the APS, but we've also got Netezza. So I did some of the coding around the Netezza, and Teradata. So it gets the size of the system objects, it gets a load of schema, and then we have a process to generate the output into a standard format to then be able to actually see how complicated it is. And even on the Netezza one, we go across, we collect schema information for you, and then we can actually script out that if you need it. So there's a lot of things in here for the Netezza. So I'd look at that. We are in the process of updating that at the moment. So because the assessment is such an important phase, assessing what you've got and then know how complicated it's going to be is key. So the data migration team, or the DMG, I've got a load of scripts as well. So they've got scripts for coming from the APS, using Polybase, using other methods, DB2 scripts, Netezza DDL conversion, so converting tables across, whole Netezza to SQL DW, Oracle, Teradata, and I think there's also some white papers on there. I popped this in here. So this is a training course on a cloud workshop on migrating to SQL Data Warehouse or SQL. So this should be Synapse Analytics here, SQL pool. But this is a whole process to show you how to do it from SQL Server. So this will, by following a lot of the steps, this will show you how it can be done. I just thought that might be useful to have. It's the same one, okay. And these are actually the same one, but I'll click on here. So someone in the engineering team, this young man here, has written some scripts to help with migrations. So where was that? Underneath there, wasn't it? So underneath here are some SQL scripts he's written, because some functionality that is supported in Teradata systems isn't supported natively in SQL pools, but he's written some functions to enable that. So I think, for example, like date comparison, months between, months between, the next day, etc. So this would save you a lot of effort. You would have to write these if you were moving from Teradata and you wanted to keep that Teradata support there. And obviously I put in don't forget Data Factory. So very specifically on SQL Server, we've got the link, and that's just a deep link directly into the data migration. So you had a look at this before. And then this is the Data Factory connector for SQL Server. If we're doing APS, we've got the scripts that I showed you. We've also got the Data Factory, we've also got the data migration team, and then we've also got the SQL connector as well. So if we're pulling data off an APS, we can use this and we've also got, if we were pulling it from Synapse, we've also got that one there. Obviously this would link back to Polybase in the background. So if we're coming from Oracle or Exadata, we've got the data migration, which I showed you earlier. We've got the SQL Server Migration Assistant, which we can download here. And this shows you kind of how to use it. So this will connect up to the Oracle system or the Exadata system and then spit out code for the data warehouse. We also have this video here, although its URL is not very nice. This is a link to one of the product teams. So it shows you how to use it and how it works. So I'm not going to go through this because effectively it's all here for you. And SQL Developer. Now, probably when I was developing for an Oracle, when I was doing a SQL Server to Oracle migration, I was using SQL Developer quite a lot to convert my code. There's something called Scratchpad, and it will do an Oracle to SQL conversion, not a batch, but it was very useful when I was taking SQL code and seeing what the Oracle code was like. So certainly try that out. And then we've got our Data Factory connector. And so if you're coming from Netezza, we've actually got an article here that shows you how to use the Data Factory to move data across. With a nice little architecture diagram. You know, with the best practices here, how to configure the run times, how to estimate pricing, etc. So this is quite a nice thing to have because it shows that kind of we thought about it. If you go into Data Factory, there is a Netezza template already built. So you can just go into there and it will then just go, right, tell me where your Netezza is. And then tell me where you want the data to go. Obviously, the scripts and utilities here, the one that our team wrote. You've got the one here, which data migration team, so you can look into those. These are open source, so you can go in and look at what's being done, and then you can improve it yourself. And obviously, this is a Data Factory Netezza connector. All right, so this is the Teradata migration. We also have some documentation on the Teradata migration. So that one's the Data Factory one. And then this one is that's it, here's the article. And obviously this maps quite closely to what we were talking about. The fact finding, which is effectively the assessment, defining, the criteria for proof of concept, data laying, modeling, identifying a migration path, and then executing the migration. So this should all be very, very similar conceptually. And then there's also a white paper on Teradata Migration. Now there's also something very special which I'm going to show you now, which is a tool, an internal tool that we've been using to help with Teradata migrations. So as Microsoft, we've got another tool in our arsenal to help with migrations, and it's this, and I've had special permission to show it to you. It's called, and it's Teradata, which is Italian for translate. So it's a tool that's been written in-house. We're not sharing it with anyone yet, so this is very, very, very early. But what it is doing, it will help translate from different sources to different destinations. So, well, to SQL DW, to different sources. So what I've got, just to show it off, I've got a number of scripts. So just to create table script, let's do edit. There we go. A very simple create table script coming from Teradata. A couple of stored procedures, nothing major. I just wanted to show you kind of doing some value, saying okay. Then we need to run the tool, put an input folder, put an output folder. Tool runs, picks up those files, tells us that we've got one copy activity, we've done two stored procedures, and we've also got a create table. Now what it does is it will try and assist you and actually create the schema if it needs to create a schema for you, and also create some scripts to help apply it for you. So if we go and have a look at our output folder, it looks something like this. We've got our procedures that it's moved across. We've got our tables, and that has actually come from the output script. So it's gone, right, we think we need a hash distribution on there, and creates a non-clustered index on associate ID. So it saves you a lot of hassle from just migrating all that code across. And then we've got Hadoop. So a couple of customers of mine have been using Hadoop. We've also got an article on how to do the migration with Hadoop, but using Hadoop, moving the data across, and then using a couple of, and in fact it was probably three of them were using a very similar technique of using Hive, looking at the metadata in Hive, extracting it out and using that as the schema for the tables, and then applying that to data warehouse so they could automatically build tables based upon files without having to kind of pre-build it all in advance. So a very, very dynamic system. Drop a file in a folder, and then it will then go and create a table of that name in the data warehouse for you at some point later on. So what was interesting was that these customers came up with that technique separately. So that's it for the session. So today we covered migrating and modernizing. So we looked at all the kind of issues that we have with taking pretty much any system, migrating to another system, mostly focusing on the data warehouse, some very specific Azure SQL Data Warehouse Synapse parts in there. But essentially most of it is very generic. So we use these techniques and these scripts to migrate, Hadoop, Hive stores, to migrate APSs, to migrate Redshift, to migrate Teradatas, to migrate Netezers, and then kind of DB2, and then my other colleagues have done green plums and other systems that I've never heard of. So you can see that by following the same kind of methodology, you can extract the data out, build the schemas. You can get to a POC and you can get to a migration pretty quickly. You just have to be very careful with identifying kind of how much effort is going to be and kind of how much ETL work there is. So so we've covered assessment. So we've covered who migrations, about blockers, drivers, assessments, migrations, and the tooling. So I just want to say thank you for attending and have a great virtual SQL bits. Okay, bye.